Well, I anticipated I wouldn't have a lot of time this morning. And so we're just going to look at a little bit of the Gospel of Mark. For example, the first two words. Kata Markon, according to Mark. The title of the book, according to Mark. The Gospel of Mark has, since the earliest days of the church, been credited to a man in the New Testament whose name appears some 6 or 7 times there, identified as John Mark. John was a Jewish name. Mark was a Greek name. Yeah, I guess we are running. And we encounter John Mark in the book of Acts. And it is helpful as God makes known to us who the authors of the books are. It is helpful to understand a bit about their lives. You know, God doesn't have any obligation to tell us who he uses to write the books that he inspires, but when he does and when he gives us some storyline behind those names, it is helpful for us in understanding and gaining from that particular book or passage of the Bible. And so this morning I just want us to look very briefly at what the Bible tells us about John Mark. And then with that little bit of knowledge, as we continue the next Sundays, going through the verses and chapters of this book, we'll be able to understand it maybe with a little bit more of a personal interest, how it was shaped and what's behind the messages to us. So, according to Mark, he first appears in Acts 12:12. When Peter realized this, and what is this? When he realized that this has not been a dream, an angel really did come and set me free from prison. The shackles dropped off his wrists and his ankles, and the jail doors opened up, and he walked out. The guards are snoring, and he walks out a free man, and then, like the next day, he was supposed to have been beheaded. But an angel of the Lord rescued him, and he thought it was a dream. But when he realized it wasn't, when the cool night air started to bite a little bit, it tells us he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. So what do we learn from this? That John Mark was the son of a woman named Mary, who owned apparently a very sizable house in Jerusalem. Sizable enough that a large number of Christians met there. They probably met there regularly, but we know at least that they were meeting there on this particular evening, having an all-night prayer meeting for the Apostle Peter. They were fighting for his life through prayer. And so apparently Peter attended the congregation that met at Mary and John Mark's house. That she had such a house and that no husband is mentioned indicates that she was probably a widow, and that she had some wealth, that her husband had left her some wealth, that she would have a home like that. So John Mark apparently grew up with some measure of privilege, some measure of wealth, probably pretty well educated, and maybe had a silver spoon in his mouth. Not exactly sure, but we're going to find out also in Colossians 4:10 that Barnabas was a cousin to John Mark. And Barnabas was Saul's first mission companion. They traveled from Antioch down to Jerusalem on a benevolence assignment to bring relief to the Jewish Christians who were suffering in Jerusalem. And then they also traveled together on the first missionary journey to Cyprus, the island of Cyprus in eastern Asia Minor. And we're told that Barnabas was a Levite who was originally from Cyprus, the island of Cyprus. He was, however, in Jerusalem when we encounter him as a Levite. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that he was very well educated. He was among the religious elite And we're also told in Acts chapter 4 that he was a wealthy man. Matter of fact, he was so wealthy he had properties, and he went ahead and just sold some of his property and gave them all the proceeds to the church benevolence fund. So that confirms again that John Mark was probably raised in privilege, probably raised with wealth. He was probably a Levite, in all likelihood a Levite, so was well schooled in the scriptures and the religion. He was, in terms of our day, a wealthy white male. He had it going for him. In Acts 12:25, we're told that Barnabas and Saul, when they came from Antioch to Jerusalem to deliver the benevolent funds that had been contributed on behalf of the poor Christians there in Jerusalem, when they went back to Antioch, they took young John Mark with them. Cousin Barnabas thought, this will be a good opportunity for the lad. Come along with us, we'll disciple him, we'll mentor him, he'll be our assistant. And so John Mark traveled with them and began working with them at the church in Antioch. And then in Acts 13, when Paul and Barnabas were commissioned by the church in Antioch and sent out on the first missionary journey, and they headed to Cyprus. And what do we know about Cyprus? It was originally Barnabas' home, right? That's where Barnabas was from. And so they headed over to the turf that Barnabas would have been familiar with. And as a cousin to John Mark, it's fully within the realm of possibility that John Mark's parents may have been originally from Cyprus, and maybe he even was born there in his younger years. And so John Mark and Paul and Barnabas, they travel over to the coast of the Mediterranean. They hop a boat, they go to Cyprus, and Acts describes their mission trip there, and they literally cross the island, going to synagogues and sharing the news of this Messiah that the Jews had been looking for, who was come now, the person of Jesus, the Christ. And so they had some encounters along the way. And I don't have time to recount the encounters for you, but you can see them in Acts chapter 13. And so they finished up crossing the island of Cyprus. Was it Cyprus or Crete? That's like Elijah and Elisha to me. Jeff, which is it? Cyprus. We're going to go with Cyprus. Final answer. All right. And they finish their ministry there, and they hop a boat to the coast of Asia Minor. And that's when John Mark says, I'm done. And he, in Acts 13:13, he had been acting as their assistant, but something happened in Cyprus. Something happened in his interactions with Paul and Barnabas. And he said, I didn't sign up for this, I'm out of here. And he leaves them, and he heads back, not to Antioch, where they'd come from, but he heads back to Mama in Jerusalem. And there isn't a whole lot of commentary given us in the book of Acts about why he left, or even about how Paul and Barnabas felt about him leaving. But I should say there's not a lot of explanation, but by the time we get to Acts 15, we're told this. Now, Barnabas and Paul are planning to go on their second missionary journey, and Barnabas wanted to take John Mark along with them again. But Paul did not think that wise to take the one who had abandoned them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. And there was such a sharp disagreement that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus again, but Paul chose Silas and departed and went through Syria and Cilicia. And so the issue of why Mark left them was something that Paul said, he's disqualified. He's unacceptable. I cannot work with him. I will not work with him. And Paul and Barnabas disagreed so strongly that they parted ways. And these guys had been ministry partners for years, through thick and thin. But whatever John Mark did, Paul found it absolutely unacceptable. And fortunately, that's not where the story ends, though. for John Mark. You might have guessed that since he ended up writing one of the Gospels. Right? We read in Colossians 4, verse 10, Paul is writing to the Colossian church, and he says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas' cousin Mark. And if he comes to you, welcome him. And in Philemon, Paul again writes, he says, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends greeting to you, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. And so by the time Paul is writing these epistles, Mark and Paul have now been reconciled, and Paul now regards Mark as somebody that is a trusted and valued colleague and partner in ministry. And that is confirmed in the very last book that Paul wrote, 2 Timothy. He writes in 2 Timothy 4:11, Luke alone is with me. He's in prison and he's feeling abandoned. He says, Luke's the only one left with me. Would you please get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. And so there's a complete reversal. Paul, who absolutely rejected Mark, I can't work with him, I won't work with him, is now asking for him. Would you get Mark? Would you ask him to come? He's very helpful and useful to me. But there's even a little bit more about Mark. In 1 Peter 5:13, the Apostle Peter is writing this letter, and Peter is also in Rome, where Paul was as a prisoner. Peter ends up a prisoner there too. And Peter writes this, the church in Babylon, which is a code name for Rome, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, as does my son Mark. And so there, Peter, the Apostle Peter, refers to John Mark as his son in the Lord, his spiritual son. Wow! That's quite a recovery. That's quite a rebound. I don't know, I really can't think of many people that the Apostle Paul regarded as disqualified, that Paul rejected. What an amazing recovery we see in the life of John Mark. And by the way, the the Gospel of Mark is regarded to be the gospel that really was Peter's experience of Jesus. Peter had encountered Jesus early on in Jesus' ministry. Peter really wasn't there for the birth, the angels and the shepherds and the manger and all that. Peter kind of ended the story when Jesus was beginning ministry. But early church records indicate that Mark wrote the story of Jesus' life, because Mark himself didn't know it. Mark hadn't been around when Jesus was there physically, but he actually took Peter's memories, Peter's recollections, Peter's experiences, and wrote them down for him. Papias, the early church father who lived from 60 AD to 135 AD, called John Mark Peter's interpreter, Peter's aide, Peter's spokesperson. John Mark, who walked away. John Mark who forsook. John Mark who abandoned his cousin Barnabas, who abandoned the Apostle Paul, who walked away from the cost of following discipleship. Maybe he even walked away from the faith for a while. I didn't sign up for this. I mean, let's face it, he had been among the elite. He'd been a Levite, a religious elite. He'd been among the wealthy elite. He'd been among the Jewish elite. And even when, he and his mama became Christians and believers, they started hobnobbing with the apostles, the Christian elites. And then he was recruited by Paul. Come with me. And went up to Antioch, and he's involved in the church there. I just get the feeling that up until the point that Mark went on mission with Paul and Barnabas, his life had been glamorous. You know, even going to Antioch and working in the Jerusalem church, come on, it was a mega church. It exploded. 5,000 people in one day, 3,000 people in a day. I mean, it's phenomenal to be a part of that. And then he goes to Antioch where God's doing this amazing work. And, outside of the Jewish people are starting to become Christians now. And he's part of all the excitement. And it's great and it's glamorous. And then he goes on a mission trip to Cyprus. And he probably encountered some extended family there that didn't think what he was doing was so cool. They weren't believers. They thought they were following this cult, this false Messiah, this charlatan pretender Jesus. And he probably began encountering some hardships and some rejection. And it was really starting to be a life of sacrifice and suffering. And he said, enough of that. Can you relate? I grew up in a very devout Christian home where the greatest thing you could be in life was a missionary for Jesus. Welcome to the elite, Daphne. Second thing you could do was be a pastor. Third thing you could do was be president of the United States. And so early on, I surrender all to Jesus. Yeah, I'm willing to be a full-time missionary for Jesus. I'm going to head to the far reaches of the world. And when I was in college, I got to first experience that. I spent a summer down in Colombia, South America, where you can't drink the water. And even if you don't, you're still going to get nasty stuff. And where I got the record on our team for being sick the most days. And the point is, all the glamour that I had seen in being a missionary, being a pastor, being a Christian elite was gone. And at that point, being a Christian, I realized meant living here like a missionary there. It meant self-denial, it meant sacrifice, it meant suffering, it meant people looking at you like, I don't want to talk to you, leave me alone. You're a fanatic, you're a nut, you're crazy, whatever. The glamour was gone. And when I came back from Colombia, my yes to the Lord was a much more sober and serious yes. Lord, if you call me, I'll go. Beats the alternative. From the belly of the whale, Nineveh looks great. It's been my motto. From the belly of the whale, Nineveh looks great. But I think that's what happened to John Mark here. So John Mark, who failed and disappointed the Apostle Paul so badly that Paul wrote him off and refused to work with him. John Mark, who later became very close to Peter, the disciple associated with spectacular failure. Of all the disciples, which one is at the top of the list of spectacular fails? Lord, if everybody else denies you, I never will. I'll die for you. Peter, I'll give you 12 hours before you deny me 3 times. Before you deny me 3 times. Never, Lord. Never. Blankety blank, I tell you, I don't know him. And that wasn't the end of Peter's miscues, was it? And I didn't even talk about the one where they're on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus shows up, and Moses and Elijah, right? Fred, not Pete. And Peter goes, whoa, we should probably make some tents here. We should probably make some shrines here. And the voice from heaven interrupts him. This is my son, whom I'm well pleased in. Listen to him. Moses and Elijah are not equal with my son. They don't get their own shrines. He's the only one that gets the shrine. Peter, think. And even after Pentecost, And now we're preaching the good news of Jesus to Jews and Gentiles. And Peter was the one who was so influenced by peer pressure that he reverted back to this exclusivism where Jews won't associate with Gentiles, won't eat with them. And Paul said, I had to withstand him to his face. Peter, you're out of line. You're out of line. And so Peter had to be corrected by the Apostle Paul. Even as an apostle, Peter had some spectacular fails. You know, I want to claim Paul, but I'm Peter. What about you? John Mark, the unreliable, who was restored and in the end became a trusted, relied upon co-worker of both Paul and Peter. You know, it's no coincidence that Mark's gospel divides pretty much in half. The first half highlighting all Jesus' power and mighty deeds and miracles and healings and just authority that embarrassed the scribes and the Pharisees. And then the second half given over to the passion of Jesus, where he is rejected, where he is despised, where he is humiliated, where he suffers and he dies hanging on the cross. And right in between chapters 8 through 10 is the watershed. The watershed where Jesus says, I'm the Son of Man, I am he, the one you're looking for, and oh, by the way, I came to suffer and to die and to give my life for others. And let me tell you that anyone who follows me is going to have to follow that same path. And so Mark chapters 8 through 10, you're going to find emphasize Jesus' tough teaching on the cost of discipleship. If anyone wants to follow me, they better count the cost, because here it is. It's not cheap. It's not easy. It's going to demand your life. And I think Mark and his experience comes through in that structure of the gospel, because Mark was somebody that signed on the front end. Hey, with all this miracle and power stuff, with all this, stomping on the scribes and Pharisees, I'm there. Mark joined there like so many did. The crowds, even the apostles. But when it got to this part, I've come to suffer, I've come to sacrifice, I've come to deny myself, I've come to give my life for the will of God. Mark said, whoa, haven't signed up. That's not what I'm here for. Can you relate to that? Can you relate to when God has asked you to take a step to do something and you said, I don't have it in me. I don't have it in me. I can. But it was, of course, 40 years ago. I mean, I've got it all together now. Every day. Every day. Mark, like so many, including his mentor Peter, found himself eager to follow Jesus, the mighty miracle, but balked when Jesus began leading him through the place of sacrifice and suffering and self-denying. And I look at myself and I say, I don't know how to get there. I know that's what you want from me. I know that's right and proper and good and fitting, and I should be there, but I don't know how to get the want to. I don't know how to get the willing to. Is there any hope for me? What do you think John Mark would answer? What do you think Peter would answer? Jesus didn't write Mark off, didn't write Peter off. Mark the forsaker became Mark the gospel writer in the Bible. Peter the grand failure became Peter the apostle and rock of the church. Mark the great disappointment to Paul became Mark the valued partner of Paul. Who are you so disappointed with that you would write them off and give up on them? Perhaps yourself? If Jesus can turn a cross into a crown, death into eternal life, rejection by masses into salvation for millions, what can't he do with we disappointments and our shortcomings and failures? I'm interested to see how Mark went from walking away to becoming the pillar of a disciple of Jesus that he was.